In this chapter, we're going to cover two important aspects of hacking an organization. That's web server attacks and web application attacks. Frequently, the target of websites is to deface them or get data from the application or the underlying databases. But you have to go through the server first. And attacking a server is a lot like attacking another server that runs different services like DNS or SMTP and so forth. They're all susceptible to the same kind of attacks. Now, web servers are frequently attacked because of their public, internet-facing nature. They sit on the internet, possibly in our demilitarized zone, but they are accessible by people on the internet for a good reason. We want information to be out there. We want to be able to provide it to our customers and our employees in the case of remote applications that they might use to log their timesheets, for example, or access other data. Now, web server hacks basically are the first step in getting to the website or the web application itself in order to do evil things to it, deface it, or get data off of it. Now, web servers are prone typically to the same types of attacks that other kinds of servers suffer. In other words, if you had an SMTP server or a DNS server and so forth, there are a few basic attacks that any server could suffer. Obviously, because of the nature of what it does, there are some specific attacks you would wage against a web server versus a DNS server, for example. But by and large, attacks that affect the operating system and the hardware itself are almost the same. Denial of service attacks, DNS poisoning attacks, for example, attacking weak or poor configuration settings on a server, poor patching practices, and so forth. Those are all things that most servers suffer from. Now, web servers also, unfortunately, may offer an entryway into an organization's internal network if they're not configured and secured properly. So, in addition to getting to the application and getting to the data on the web server, hackers could use the web server as a jumping point to get inside the organization's network. So that's something we have to think about as well. Now, web server attacks, which is what we're going to be talking about for the next few sessions, can be implemented using some of the same methods as other server attacks. And we're talking things like network attacks, where we might attack different services, port scan, look at different protocols that are unsecure, for example. We also might look at configuration attacks. How is the server, particularly its operating system and application, configured? Is it secure? Are there default passwords on there? Are there blank passwords for some of the user accounts? Are the shares and files and folders locked down? So those are some of the things we may attack any server with. We also look at things, vulnerabilities that might be on the box, like unpatched software or unpatched operating systems. Poor authentication methods such as simple password authentication and maybe password policies that don't involve complex passwords or lengthy passwords might be something we would target. And again, improperly set permissions on files and folders and other types of shares that are on the box might be something that a hacker would target. Some of the things that we might look at specifically for a web server, and some of these are very generic and some of these are specific to web servers, are default configuration. In other words, how did it get configured after it was installed right out of the box? Did it get locked down, or is it still in its default state? Any default files that might be out there. A lot of web server applications like Apache and IIS use default files and default directory structures. That, unfortunately, if not locked down, could leave the web server wide open to attack. Unnecessary services on the box might be an issue. If you're running a web server, do you really need DNS as a server service running, or SMTP? A lot of these relate to multi-purpose boxes. A lot of people, because of a budget or because of the need to have multiple services out there on the internet, may put multiple services on them, a web server, an email server, and so forth. Unfortunately, that opens up the box to a wide range of attacks. What you want to do is minimize the attack surface by minimizing what runs on the box. Lack of port filtering, and this may not be something that's done by the box itself. It may be something that should be done by an external router or external firewall. But if you don't filter these ports, and ports are open that shouldn't be, well, then you've left yourself open to a couple of attacks. Unpatched applications and operating systems may allow vulnerabilities that are either zero-day or, even worse possibly, vulnerabilities that have been out there for a while, wide open and susceptible to attack. File and directory permissions. Having it so everyone can read or write to a directory would be a bad thing, because a hacker could upload malicious software or viruses to an open directory, or they could access and read files they shouldn't read from a directory. Simple or default passwords obviously is an issue. If you have passwords that aren't configured or are blank or don't meet complexity requirements, then those are easy targets for web server hacking. Also, lack of authentication or weak authentication mechanisms. Using weak protocols or using weak authentication methods might be an issue. It's something that the web server would be susceptible to attack through. Any unsecured connection with other hosts. A lot of times, if you can get into a web server, it may not have a secure connection to another host, or it may have a trusted connection to another host. And if that's the case, you can bounce from that compromised web server to another host and on into the internal network. SSL certificate issues could also be an avenue to attack the web server with. It could be an expired certificate or a self-generated certificate or a certificate that's been compromised. Any of these issues could be a problem. Weak operational security, and this might be administrators not performing backups on a regular basis or not going through a security checklist, for example, could be an avenue into attack the web server as well. And finally, no security devices. In other words, putting a web server out there where there's no border router and no firewall would definitely be a way for a hacker to take advantage of that server and completely take it over eventually. So these are some of the things that a hacker definitely thinks about and a defender also needs to think about, and we're going to talk about some of these as we go through the next few sessions. Now that we've generally talked about attacking web servers, let's get a little bit more specific and talk about some of the attacks that can be waged against a web server. Now, obviously, since it is just a server, it's vulnerable to several attack vectors just like all the other servers, whether they're DNS servers, email servers, or even file servers. Unfortunately, though, web servers have the added vulnerability of being accessible from the internet by all manner of hackers. Now, web server attacks not only target the physical box itself and the network that it's running on and the operating system that's on the system, but also the web server software itself and any applications that are used to host the website. And when we talk about web server software, we're really talking about the two big players in the field, some form of Apache and Microsoft's Internet Information Server. Now, there are other ones out there, obviously, but the market is pretty much led by those two pieces of software, Apache and IIS. So obviously, a lot of the attacks are targeted directly for them. Now, the attacks against web servers pretty much follow the same methodology that you could use against other types of hosts. And we're talking servers and workstations and other network devices. So you would still footprint and enumerate a web server. Now, first you would footprint it using some standardized and some specialized tools. Obviously, the standardized tools would be things like the Whois, DNS footprinting, and some of the other footprinting methods we've talked about. Some of the specialized tools might include something like Netcraft, for example, and we're going to talk about Netcraft a little bit later. Then you would enumerate the techniques to get information about users, any services, configuration information, OS patches, and so forth. Again, the whole reason you're getting this information is to figure out your attack vectors, to find the vulnerabilities and decide that those vulnerabilities are the ones you want to go after. Then you would switch your targeting to system attacks. In other words, you would go after the system itself, possibly the operating system and its configuration, the web server software itself, or the applications. So you may be looking for weak passwords, missing patches that may allow a vulnerability to be exploited that doesn't take care of a vulnerability, flaws in the operating system, and so forth. If you find open shares or open directories, or you're otherwise able to, you might, as a hacker, even install malware on the system. And this might be things like a keystroke logger or a malicious script, for example, that would delete the website, or any manner of other things you can install on there, Trojans and so forth. And you might use this to infect the server and its applications so that it prevents the server from working properly, or it spreads malware throughout the network. Now, you also have these network attacks you could launch against the server, and this might result in a denial of service condition, and something like that might be ICMP attacks or SYN floods or something of that nature, if the administrator has not hardened the OS and the network against those types of attacks. You also see a really popular attack, and that's DNS hijacking, and that involves changing the DNS entries for a web server or polluting a cache such that users may go to a different website, one that you've set up. So there are all kinds of different network attacks you could wage against that box also. You could also look at application attacks, and we're going to talk about those later on in the course. That actually is the topic of the second half of this particular chapter. And applications attacks target the website itself and the database services. And the goal might be to access data, to get it, to steal it, or even change it. You also might have website defacement in mind as a goal if you're a hacker. So there's all these different attacks that you could wage, and a lot of them are the same as other types of servers. There are other types of attacks that you could wage against the web server that might be a little bit unique to web services. Directory transversal attacks is a popular one, and that's basically when you can put in some malicious type of entry into the URL to cause HTTP to freak out and actually backtrack from the directory that stores the HTTP web content into the operating system's directories. There's also obviously buffer overflow attacks that you could use against the operating system and the web server applications. Privilege escalation attacks. Frequently you are allowed to log on to a web server using simple credentials or even anonymously. And there may be flaws in the configuration that might allow you to escalate privileges to get administrative level or root level privileges over that box. And we've already mentioned the TCP/IP types of attacks, scans, ICMP attacks, SYN floods, and so forth. There's also a couple of attacks that are definitely unique to a web server, and that would be like the HTTP split response attack and the response hijack attack. And basically those involve masquerading as a user and sending malformed HTTP requests so that the response will be split. So the web server thinks it's replying back to the client, but it's replying back to you, and you're kind of the man in the middle there. And you would do this in order to basically get a client to send credentials and then have the response sent back to you. And there are different variations of these two attacks as well. SSL attacks would mean that you are trying to target the SSL, the secure communication session, either by exploiting a certificate that's been compromised or expired or self-generated or some other kind of weakness in the SSL. And that brings me to talking about session hijacking. That's another type of attack that you would wage against the web server in particular, because you might hijack the session, hijack credentials, and both the client and the server think they're talking to each other, but they're talking to you. And that's very similar also to a man-in-the-middle attack. And we've already mentioned as well different password and authentication attacks that you obviously could use against a particular web server or web services that run on that server. So there's all kinds of attacks out there. Now, in the next couple of sessions, we're going to look at some of the tools you would use to wage some of these attacks. Now that we've discussed some of the web hacks and attacks that are out there, let's look at some of the tools that are available to a hacker to see how they could use them against a web server and a website. There are several tools out there, and we're going to cover a few of these. We're not going to cover all of them, but there are basically some tools out there that will let you do what you need to do in terms of footprinting a web server, enumerating it, and then hacking it. And we're going to look at a few of those over the next two sessions. A couple that we'll look at are Netcraft, which basically is a web-based tool where you can enumerate and footprint a web server or a website. And you can also then take HTTrack and download the entire site so you can look at it more closely offline. Maybe you can alter it and upload it back to either the original site if you can, or to a bogus site, and then trick users to going to that site instead. Now, we've looked at Nmap and Nesses, of course, and those can be used to footprint and enumerate a particular website. They can also be used to get vulnerability information as well. And some other tools out there are IDServe, Burp Suite, and Brutus. So let's go ahead and take a look at a few of these tools right now. The first tool we're going to look at is Netcraft. And Netcraft is on the internet, and you can use it to look at websites and get information about them, footprint them, and get vulnerability information from them sometimes, or just simply enumerate them. Now, Netcraft also has a toolbar you can download for Firefox and some of the other browsers, and when you do that, you can use it for internal servers as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at a particular site. Let's do VTC.com, and we're just going to see some of the things that Netcraft can show us on the VTC.com site. And some of the things we see basically are some of the things we may have seen earlier when we footprint and enumerate the VTC.com organization. But there are some things here, obviously, that we might get out of it. And here's VTC.com right here. And there's a site report we can take a look at. Now you can look at the site itself. Let's go back to Netcraft. Let's look at the site report here. And this is Netcraft's site report for VTC.com. So it gives you information about the site title, its ranking, language, how long it's been up, and so forth. But it can give you information about the network itself. The IP address, who owns the domain, who's registered it, what country it resides in, its name servers, and so forth. And we know that it uses Amazon US East data center. And here's the NetBlock owner here. We can also see what the OS and web server look like. And there is a security risk rating that Netcraft can give you. And right now there are no risks for this particular website. The site technology that it may use. And some of this information may not be information you could use to attack a site, but it just may be helpful to know how the site is set up. It talks about the different technologies in use, the client-side technologies that you could use with it, and so forth. So that's Netcraft. And again, basically it can give you some information on the website itself. And there's other sites as well that can give you some similar information, and probably you could use a couple of these tools to get different kinds of information from the website. One of the things we're going to use over the next couple of sessions is a downloadable web application, web server called badstore.net. And badstore is meant to be insecure. And the premise of it is that you can use attacking tools to attack badstore.net and see how vulnerabilities actually work and see how poor coding techniques can contribute to bad web servers and bad web applications. So this is another tool we're actually going to use other tools against it as well over the next couple of sessions. And basically you download badstore.net from the web. It's an ISO you can create a CD and boot a computer off of, or you can do like I've done and place it in a VM. And I'm accessing it from the web browser right now. It's on an IP address of 192.168.163.145. So we're going to use a couple of tools coming up on badstore.net. So those are the two tools for this segment, Netcraft, which we could use to look at internet sites, and Badstore, an introduction to Badstore that I'm going to take you through over the next couple of sessions. As I mentioned previously, we're going to use badstore.net, which is a downloadable website that has a lot of vulnerabilities to it. And we can use this to practice on so that we don't actually hack in any actual sites. You can download this as an ISO, and I have done so and loaded it on a VM, and we've given it the IP address of 192.168.163.145. And I want to use a couple of tools against badstore.net, and if you download it and look at the documentation, you'll see that it's a little bit of an older program from like around 2005 or so, but it has a lot of vulnerabilities in it that you can use to test your hacking skills against and your software against. So the first thing I'm going to do is run an Nmap scan against it and then a Nessus scan against it to see what vulnerabilities we get and to footprint it kind of and enumerate what's running on it. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm looking at ZenMap here, and I've run an intent scan on the badstore.net site. And what I've got here is a lot of different things here. I've got some open ports, obviously, which we expected to get. So we have port 80 open, HTTP. We have port 443 open, which is the SSL port. So we know that it can use ports 80 and 443, the standard web ports, and the standard secure SSL port. But I also got some banner information here. So I see that it's running Apache daemon here, the Apache web server 1.3.28, which is a little bit of an insecure version. It's an older version. And we know that it's running on Unix or Linux, because we can see some other things in there that would tell us that. We also are seeing some interesting things here about some potentially vulnerable situations here with the web server itself and how it's set up. So that could give us some information here. We see what ciphers it's supporting. So this web server is actually giving up a lot of information. We also see that it's running MySQL, an older version again, 4.1.7, and that has some vulnerabilities connected with it too. So right off the Nmap scan, we see that there's some useful information we could get off of this server that we could take advantage of. So one of the next steps would be to run a Nessus scan and see what vulnerabilities we come up with, and also start researching vulnerabilities on the web, getting information about the particular versions of software that we see on it that might have some existing vulnerabilities we could take advantage of. So let's go ahead and switch over to Nessus and see what Nessus comes up with. So here we're looking at a Nessa scan of Bad Store, and we can see there's some red and some orange there. So let's take a look at what it came up with. So we've got quite a few vulnerabilities on this particular website, some serious ones. We've got vulnerabilities obviously that have to do with Apache, the version of server that it's running, and we know that it's a little bit old. We also know that it's running MySQL, an older version, and there's just some vulnerabilities here that we could obviously take advantage of if we knew exactly what to do and how they were set up. So the remote database server can be accessed without a password. That's one interesting one that we could take advantage of. We also have some MySQL server default account credentials. So that's one of the things, administrators should do immediately is change default credentials, default passwords and administrators. And obviously on this site that hasn't been done. We know that it's been done this way intentionally for us. But there's some CV information out on here. And if you look through here a little bit, here is the port that the MySQL server is running on, and we get some default usernames and passwords here. This is the following remote credentials that Nessus was able to log into the box with. Scrutinizer, admin, Monty, Sumpass, MySQL. These are common passwords that Nessus used to get into the database portion of this web server. So if we go back here, we'll see some other things here. Here's a critical one right here. And the critical one basically tells you that there is a heap-based buffer overflow vulnerability that we could execute against this particular server. Now, how would you execute that vulnerability? Well, you'd have to have some exploit code, or better yet, if you want to make it easy on yourself, you could use something like Metasploit that comes with Backtrack. You could use the free version or the commercial version, Metasploit Pro, and you could use it to attack this web server and actually exercise these vulnerabilities. So this gives you some information on what's out there that you could take advantage of. So obviously there's a lot of information here on the particular web server that is very vulnerable. Got some highs and one critical here. The next thing I want to do is take a look at HTTP Tracker so we can show you how you can actually download a copy of the website for offline viewing and manipulation. So let's go ahead and take a look at that as well. So we're in our Windows box again, our XP box, and I have HTTrack website copier. And let's go through the wizard that it gives us here. And it can actually give us, I'm just going to say Bad Store as the project name here. Project category, you can put test in here. And base path, my websites. And what we need to do is put the web address here. And I'm going to put http:// and 192.168.163.145 in here. And there's some options we can use as well. We can look at the different options, the scan rules, what kind of files to download and so forth. I'm going to leave everything at its default. I'm going to say next here. And we should be able to go ahead and finish this. We don't need a remote access connection here. And let's just go here and do this. And it's starting to scan files. It's starting to grab the different files from Bad Store. Now it's going to take a while, so we're going to pick this up at a different session here. So we'll open up and see what it got for us. The next part of this course involves discussion on web application hacking. Now we've talked about attacking the server itself and some attack techniques as well as some tools. Now we're going to look at web application hacking itself. Now beyond the server and the web server software such as IIS or Apache, web-based applications are also vulnerable to a wide variety of attacks. And in fact, really attacking the server or the web server software is just an intermediary goal to get to the web application itself. Web application attack vectors include attacks on the website content itself, the web interface, the web application logic, and even related supporting software such as database software like SQL Server, MySQL, and so forth. Now, web attacks can come in all kinds of flavors. They can be client or server-side attacks, and they can use several methods of attack, including scripting attacks, injection attacks, some identity validation attacks, and even others. Now, what are the goals of web application hacking? What are we trying to get out of this? Well, we might be trying to get data access or be able to alter data. For example, we might try to target a web server that is the front end for a database application. We might want to get in there and either get unauthorized access to that data to get it out of the web application or even to alter it. We also might want to deface the website. A lot of hacktivists, for example, basically deface websites to carry a message to the public based upon their particular beliefs. We also might want entry into a network. A lot of web applications, unfortunately, are sitting on unsecure servers, and they connect to an internal network somewhere. They're not separated by a DMZ like we would like for them to be. So sometimes hacking into a web server and the web application itself can get you an entryway into the internal network. A lot of times a hacker will also target a web application in order to carry out an attack on any clients that connect to it, any users that use that particular web application. So those are some of the goals of web application hacking from a hacker's perspective. Now, there are multiple possible vectors that you could use to attack a website or a web application. Things, and this is not all inclusive, of course, but things like improper permissions set on directories and files, where anyone could look at those directories or read those files or even execute things in those directories. You also might take advantage of weak or non-existent authentication. Sometimes basic authentication is used where there's a plain text password. Sometimes the authentication is not configured properly. There's also malicious input, and this is typically in the form of input validation issues or parameter issues. You also might see some hackers try to upload malicious scripts to a web application so that they can be later downloaded to a client. This is an example of cross-site scripting, for example. And don't forget malware. There are attacks that involve the use of malware, Trojans, and other things we've discussed already to get that loaded on the application, on the web server, so it can either be downloaded to a client without their knowledge, or so it can disrupt operations on the server itself. Now, there are several tools and techniques that are available to hackers that they could use to attack web applications, and they're probably too numerous to mention all of them here. But a couple of the popular ones, in fact, a couple that we'll look at closely, are Acunetics Web Scanner, Metasploit, which we've already discussed a little bit, and some other tools and techniques. And some of these don't even require tools. Some of these require just knowing how to get the right attack in motion. For example, putting SQL injection into an input field is really just knowledge and how to do it. Now, here's some of the different hacks and some of the weaknesses and vulnerabilities, if you will, that could affect web applications. You have cookie access and alteration, and as you know, a cookie is basically a text file that's placed on a client's machine so that it can store information about their visit to a website, so that maybe they get a better user experience. Unfortunately, sometimes authentication information can be placed there too, and those cookies are not always secure. They can be forged, they can be accessed, they can be altered. You also might have directory browsing of the website itself. This is called directory traversal, and this might involve looking at directories, some of them not related to the site, some of them possibly related to the operation of the web server, where a hacker could look and find the different files on there, sensitive files possibly, and even interact with those files, such as read them or write to those directories and so forth. You also might have input validation attacks, and this is basically where an attacker would put input into a field, for example, a form field, where you would expect normal types of information to go, a username, for example, or a last name and a first name, and they may put input in there like a series of numbers or characters that the web server or web app can't handle, and that would cause it to do some interesting things. Cross-site scripting, I already mentioned, and that might be where you get a malicious script uploaded to the server so it can be downloaded later to a client's machine. You also have parameter attacks, where different parameters in input fields might be input into the web application form, and this could also be considered form attacks as well, that the web application doesn't react well to. So there's no input validation, there's no parameter checking, and so forth. There's also things like authentication attacks if the web application is not set up to use solid, strong authentication. If it's using basic password authentication, for example, it might store the passwords improperly or not encrypt them, or store them in a plain text file that's easily readable. You also, as I mentioned, have injection attacks, such as SQL and XML injection. There's also cross-site forgery attacks, permissions problems, and a host of others. Error handling, for example, can be important because errors can report back information about the website, but the right error could also cause the website or web application to do weird things like spit up a prompt, for example. You also have the standard application types of issues that you might see, buffer overflows and so forth. You also might see connection vulnerabilities, how the web server is set up to connect to the outside world, whether it's via VPN or another network connection. There might be vulnerabilities there. And finally, if all else fails, sometimes a hacker may just wage a denial of service attack on the website itself so no one can use it. So these are just some examples of things that a hacker could do to a web application. Now, one of the programs I want to demonstrate to you is Acunetics Web Vulnerability Scanner, and this is just a trial edition, so there are certain things we can and can't do with it. But what I want to show you is what it can do in terms of scanning a web application and the vulnerabilities it can come up with. Now, we used Nessus a little bit earlier to scan our bad store site. So let's use this Acunetics Web Vulnerability Scanner to see what else we can come up with. So I'm going to use it to grab that particular web server, which we know is an internal network, 192, 168, 163, 145. Although we'll tell you that for a good demonstration, Acunetics provides several vulnerable websites that you can actually scan with it, and it will give you full information on their vulnerabilities, and you can kind of see how vulnerable some websites are and how Acunetics can pick this stuff up. So let's select our bad store site here. I'm going to click Next. I'm going to leave the defaults at what they are at. Click Next again. And this is our target information. It's going to kind of tell us what we're working with here, Apache 1.3.28. And I'm going to click Next and go with the scan. I'm not going to give it any authentication information or anything like that. This might be what a hacker would do as well. So we get a basic warning about the Acunetics sensor. We can skip that. We're going to say Finish, and we're going to run the scan here. Now this can take a few minutes to run. So we're probably going to pause the recording and come back when it finishes so I can show you what vulnerabilities it comes up with. So this can take a few minutes. Okay, our scan is finished, and it's come up with quite a few vulnerabilities here. We have 88 alerts, 16 of them are high, 36 are medium, and 11 are low, and 25 are informational. Let's take a look at some of the higher ones here. And one good thing about Acunetics is it tells you, you click on it, and it tells you what information is there. Now, the trial version does not give you as much information as we would like to see, but it does give you some information on what the vulnerability is. The mod rewrite here. Here we have SQL injection. It is vulnerable to SQL injection attacks. This website is. We have other things here listed. And some of these you can look up on the CVE sites or other vulnerability sites, and they will tell you what this vulnerability is and how an attacker could exploit it. Now, typically, you will not be able to exploit them with a scanner. You would have to use something like Metasploit, which we'll take a look at again here in a few minutes. But all of these errors here can be exploited, all these issues, these vulnerabilities. Some of these are just informational vulnerabilities. Basically, you can upload files to the server. Okay, that by itself is not necessarily bad, but what if an attacker were to upload malware or a malicious script? So you have a lot of different vulnerabilities here in this particular website, this badstore.net. And there's some other tools over here we can take a quick look at, like the blind SQL injector here. It would actually help you formulate an SQL injection attack against a particular website. Now, the site itself, the trial version rather of Acunetics Web Vulnerability Scanner won't do that for us. But what we can do also is take a look at the other vulnerability sites that it gives us, and we can take a look and see how they look, and we can actually get better vulnerability information from them. So let's go ahead and take a look at one of those, and we'll run it rather quickly and see what we get. Okay, Acunetics has finished scanning Acunetics' test website, which is vulnweb.com, and it actually gave us about 30 alerts, and that's a lot less than what we had with Bad Store. And let's go ahead and look at some of these and see what we get. We get some cross-site scripting vulnerabilities here that are confirmed, and basically it shows you how you could conduct a cross-site scripting attack against this particular website. Again, this is just to show you what can be done to an unsecure website. So this is not an actual website here, but it tells you what you could possibly do to conduct that attack. You have some other cross-site scripting attacks here, as well as some other types of attacks, weak password attacks. You see that admin has a weak password here. XML, external entity injection, so XML injection is a possibility with this website, as well as some other types of vulnerabilities. Here the user credentials are sent in clear text, for example. So we've got a lot of different vulnerabilities on this website as well, and there are others that Acunetics can test, and you can also test these sites yourself with some other web vulnerability scanning software. And what we're going to look at next in the next couple of sessions is how to conduct some other attacks on websites, such as SQL injection, and how to use Metasploit Pro to conduct attacks on websites. Okay, I've got Metasploit Pro running on my Windows 7 VM, and this may look a little bit different than the Metasploit you saw in a previous session. In that session, we looked at the community version of Metasploit that's sitting on Backtrack. So it's a little bit different, but it actually does the same thing. So what we want to do is scan that website, that 192, 168, 163, 145, which is the badstore.net. So I'm going to scan and put in my target address here, 192.168.163.145. And we can look at some advanced options if you like. We're not going to exclude any addresses. We don't really need to put any custom arguments in here, but you could if you wanted to. And there's all kinds of different things you can put in here, usernames, passwords, and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and hide these advanced options again and launch the scan. And it's going to take a little bit of time to scan the box. So it's going to run a scan against the Badstore website, the box that it's running, the VM itself. And it's going to use some other tools. Remember I said earlier in the course that a lot of these advanced tools with the nice fancy GUIs and so forth really just use some of our other tools as backends, like Metasploit uses Nmap, for example, as its backend scanner to do discovery scanning and so forth. And you can see here in the status window that it's calling Nmap from the command prompt. And you can see the different switches that it uses with Nmap right there. So it's starting Nmap and it's going to scan for a little while. And it can take a little bit of time to scan here. So we're going to watch it scan a little bit. We'll see what we get out of it. So it's finished its Nmap scan. And basically it found a lot of the things we would expect to find that we saw earlier in Nmap. We saw port 3306 open, which is MySQL, 443 for HTTPS, and port 80 open. So we can also do some other things in Metasploit Pro. We can click brute force here, and I'll show you some of the options it can give you. It gives you the ability to brute force certain services, for example, and you can turn all of these on if you like. And it's showing you that there's a lockout risk. And some of these there's a high risk, and some of these there's a low risk or a medium risk, to where you could actually lock yourself out of the box itself. There's some advanced options here as well, and basically those look like the other ones that we looked at earlier, where we could exclude certain addresses out of a range. We could select certain credentials. We can even change the payload settings from interpreter. So there's some limiters here, some throttles, and so forth. And don't feel bad if you don't know what all these options mean. Metasploit can actually be very complicated, regardless of which version it is. So take the time to go through some of these and figure out exactly what they do before you launch an attack. Let's hide these advanced options here. And I'm going to go back up here, and we could select a couple of these options. And I'm going to go back, however. And we can get back to where we were before, and I'll show you the exploit tab here. And the exploit tab basically gives you the ability to exploit the vulnerabilities that you find. And we'll scroll through here, and you can use the payload settings here and the exploit selection here. You can basically pick which ports you want, which exploits you want to use, and how many you want to run at a time. So there's a lot of different options here that you can use for Metasploit Pro. I'm going to click exploit. And we're going to go ahead and let it run a little bit. It'll take a little bit of time. So we'll watch it scroll a little bit on the screen. And then I'll pause the recording so we can see what it looks like at the end there. Okay, the exploit run is complete against that box, against our badstore.net site. And it actually tried several exploits that did not work. And you can actually just click on the side here and kind of scroll up and see what some of the things it did. It did some shellcode exploits. It also saw zip by. It logged in as admin and admin a couple of times, so I know that it got access. But it sent several different vulnerabilities to the website, the application itself, the server, and so forth. So it was able to exploit some things and some things it was not. So that's really one big difference between vulnerability scanning and penetration testing. Vulnerability scanning will tell you what the possible vulnerabilities are that could be exploited, whereas penetration testing can basically confirm which ones really are exploitable. So it actually tried a few exploits based upon vulnerabilities that it found that weren't exploitable. So that can be the difference between knowing really and thinking what the vulnerabilities are. And here we can see a successful login of admin and admin. We've started some reverse shells here and so forth on it. This was just a quick demonstration. There's a lot more really to be done if you really want to attack this box. And Metasploit Pro, a lot of people like it. If you're used to the old Metasploit, though, the one that was basically just in Linux, that comes with Backtrack, then most people who have done this for a while like that one a little bit better because it gives you a little bit more flexibility than this does. So that's just a quick demonstration of Metasploit Pro attempting to exploit our Bad Store website.